On behalf of the Law School and the Lo Loken Institute for Business Law and Policy, we are so grateful to be partnering here with you. I say partnering, but really Lucy does all of the work. So please give Lucy a round of applause. So I'm going to introduce Romain first because he does have a harder assignment this evening. He has to present a position he does not agree with, which is always challenging. So let's go gently with him as you're asking questions. And, I'm sure Kim will be softer than she otherwise would have been. We'll hope. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Romain Wacziarg, who is a professor of economics here at UCLA Anderson School of Management, where he holds the Hans Hufschmid Chair in Management, and is also, as you heard, the faculty director of the Center for Global Management. Romain's very deep scholarship covers a wide variety of areas, including exploring what explains economic performance, all of the issues surrounding globalization, some of the causes and effects of the spread of global democracy and maybe the retreat of global democracy, and how deeply rooted aspects of different societies affect their economic performance today. And then on the other side of this debate, we have my friend and colleague, Professor Kimberly Clausing, who is the Eric M. Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law. She is also, there's a long list of things, I won't list all of them, but she is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. During the first part of the Biden administration, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis in the U.S. Department of the Treasury, which is the lead economist in the Office of Tax Policy. Her research examines how government decisions and corporate behavior interplay in the global economy. She's published numerous articles on taxation, climate policy, international trade, and she is the author of Open, the Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's a good read. Like you think, oh, this is going to be tough to read, but actually it's incredibly readable. It's like beach reading, but with sophistication. So it's the perfect blend. So I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. And actually both of our speakers today have PhDs in economics from Harvard, where I believe they overlapped by a few years. So with no further ado, I believe we're starting with Romain, right? Romain, you're going to start. So each of them, again, is going to speak for a little bit, and then we'll have more of a conversation after that. So we'll start with Romain. So please.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for being here at the podium for the thing, or you want to? Do I?
Up to you.
Oh, I'm good here. All right. Yeah. If you'll have me here, I'll stay here. Thank you, Kim, for coming to this event. Thanks, Michael, for helping co-organize it. Thank you all for being here. My task is to provide some justification for the Trump tariff policy. And as Michael mentioned, this is a bit unnatural because I'm actually a free trader at heart. But I think also I'm a social scientist, and you have to understand where the policy comes from. And if you see a policy enacted in real life, that means it has supporters. And indeed, the policy that is being put in place now has tremendous political support, which explains partly why it is, seeing the light of day. So I have 5 little vignettes, and they each have a title with one word. The first word is about the abandoned. And if you think about trade policy over the last decades, even going back to the post-Second World War period, the U.S. has adopted a very open trade policy. And it was, in fact, one of the leaders in, promoting trade liberalization around the world. And this policy has had very unequal effects on different categories of the population. And in particular, in recent decades, the manufacturing base of the U.S. has been very severely affected by trade with particularly low labor cost developing countries. And there's a vibrant literature in economics exploring, for example, the China shock, the idea that in 2001, China entered the WTO, was able to export to the U.S. its products, virtually without barriers. And according to Otto, Dorn, and Hansen, the main authors of the work that has documented the effects of the China shock. This has led to about somewhere between 1 and 2.4 million manufacturing employment, jobs lost to China. And so what we're witnessing now, is kind of the rebellion of those who were abandoned throughout this period of free trade. The number I just described doesn't count displacements that you had from trade with other countries besides China. So it's an underestimate of the total amount of manufacturing jobs, perhaps, that were lost during that process. And there are large negative externalities from having entire areas of the country, the Rust Belt, affected in this way. You can think about urban blight, deaths of despair, increasing incidence of drug use, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could see what's going on now as a sort of reaction to I would say the excesses of globalization. In fact, many economists were pointing to these, including Otto Dorn and Hansen, who can be, any of them, accused of being particularly in favor of the Trump administration, but yet they provided a lot of the intellectual underpinning for what's going on. So that's the first, the abandon. The second is the imbalances. So the U.S. has traditionally granted much easier access to its trading partners, to its own market than they did to their own market. And China is an example of that, where it's very hard for U.S. businesses to do business in China, but it was at least much easier for Chinese businesses to do business in the U.S. And one claim that is being made, and economists, of course, debate to a very, very great extent, whether it's true, is that this imbalance has led to trade deficits. If it's easier to export to the U.S. than it is for the U.S. to export to your country, then you're going to have a big imbalance between imports and exports. And so that's, I think the fair thing to say is that the U.S. trade deficits depend on many other factors, particularly macroeconomic factors than this, but it could be a contributory factor, and changing the trade policy of the U.S. in a direction that's more in balance with the way the U.S. are treated by others has a justification there. Beyond that, I think the very threat of tariffs can get other countries to come to the table and negotiate to reduce their own barriers. So the one example I have written on my notes here is this summer's U.S.-EU trade deal, where the U.S. obtained zero tariffs on most products, even obtained some market access for agricultural products that it previously didn't have, in exchange for placing basically a uniform 15% tariff on European goods. So it's flipping the imbalance that previously existed between the U.S. and many of its trading partners, not necessarily the EU itself, but. So the third, my second point was the imbalances. The third was about triangles. So I tried this on one of my colleagues, and I said, you should use the word triangle. So if any of you have taken undergraduate or even, managerial economics, for those of you who are in the business school, you've gone through welfare analysis and the deadweight loss of taxation, the deadweight loss. So these are the triangles I'm referring to. It's the small welfare loss that you get from imposing a policy like tariffs. And indeed, when you calculate the GDP cost of tariffs, it's really quite small, especially if you compound it over several years, because all the costs won't be paid right away when we impose the tariffs, but it will take time to play out. And so while the distributive aspects, of helping the Rust Belt and the places that were displaced before are distinct benefits, you're paying a relatively small cost for that. Even in terms of prices, the back of the envelope calculation. So right now, U.S. tariffs are about 18%, the effective tariff rate in the U.S. is about 18%. And that covers 14% of GDP, because imports are 14% of GDP. So you're talking about a 2.5 percentage point bump in prices. So you're talking not about hyperinflation, okay? And this will probably be spread over several years, not over a one-time thing, but it's not, a disaster. And what you're getting for that is protection for industries that traditionally have not received it. The fourth thing is the revenue aspect. So I was just looking at estimates of the probable revenue consequences of the tariffs, and it's a lot of money. So the estimates from the Yale Budget Lab are between $2 and $2.5 trillion. So they were estimating this as of September of 2025, based on the tariffs as they were at that time. Okay, so it's pretty much the situation we're in now. And we're in a dire fiscal situation in the US. We have a public debt to GDP ratio of about 100%, and we have a yearly deficit that's fluctuating between 5 and 6% of GDP. Last time we had a final number, it was 6.2%. And we need to find revenue sources, and the revenue sources simply aren't going to come from increasing income taxes or payroll taxes or anything like that, because there's no political willingness to do that. In fact, you've just seen the Trump tax cuts being extended. You may not agree with that, but that's what the democratic system delivered. It went through Congress, it was signed by the president, and this is the law. So there's just no willingness to raise these kinds of taxes. And tariffs, they're not really subject to the same things, in part because Congress has delegated the setting of taxes to the president. And so the president of the United States has considerable leeway to impose certain kinds of tariffs, at least. Some of them, of course, are disputed. Some of this authority is disputed. But it's much more politically, because you can say the Chinese are going to pay the tariff. There's much less of a connection to the constituents in that way. And therefore, it might be more politically palatable to raise money through tariffs than other ways. It's not the best way to raise revenues. I'm not saying that. But many economists have been advocating going toward a consumption tax. It's not a consumption tax, but it's a tax on the consumption of foreign produced goods. So it's a little bit like a consumption tax. 14% consumption. It's 14% of the way toward a consumption tax. And so that was my fourth point. And the last one is national security. And I won't talk about that, but I think there's a broad consensus that for certain categories of products, you need to have more robust national security protection, even for things that we consider to be sort of essential when it comes to manufacturing, for example, of advanced weapon systems. That could include, steel, aluminum. Like you want to have some domestic production of that so that if something happens, you're covered. And there's a broad bipartisan, consensus in the U.S. About protecting the steel industry and the aluminum industry, et cetera. And in fact, we've seen very high levels of tariffs for these industries for a long time, going back even to the Bush administration and before. So those were my five little vignettes there in defense of the Trump tariffs.
That was very well done. Thank you. That was great. Very well researched. All right, Professor Clausing.
Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Romain, for doing something that I would find very difficult to do. This event asks for a balanced view, but it's really hard for economists because 98% of them agree with basically every word that I said and or I'm about to say. Hats off, heroic job. And I think you do make some nice points. But there are a lot of problems with these policies. I think even if one liked tariffs, which I don't for a lot of reasons, the implementation has been shambolic and illegal. In addition, tariffs aren't particularly good policy. They may raise revenue, but they do it at a high efficiency cost in a regressive way that disproportionately hurts poor people, in a way that encourages corruption and rent-seeking and administrative costs, and in a way that alienates us from virtually every country in the world while generating a negative supply shock. So that's basically what I'm going to be going through. It's cheerful. I'm disappointed there's no wine with dinner, but because by the end of this, you'll all want some. All right. So if you look at the history of U.S. effective tariff rates, this is the revenue collected relative to imports. You'll see that we now are at that red dot, and that is similar to what we had during the Great Depression in terms of tariff rates. So we've normally been in the post-war era a relatively open country to trade, and we've raised revenue in other ways. The way that the tariffs have been implemented has been particularly vexing. Here's one picture from the Financial Times where it shows you the path of tariffs under the early months of 2025, and it's been extremely variable. By one count, this Trump trade war timeline, there have been 87 major developments in U.S. tax trade policy in 2025, 87 right? So there's been a huge amount of uncertainty. This is the daily trade policy uncertainty index. You see it spiking in 2025. We've got all these trackers trying to just even keep track of what the tariffs are. We've got a lot of importers who don't know. And so it's been a really difficult situation. There's also the question of whether the tariffs are even constitutional. Those of you who are from the law school are aware that we have this document that endows in Article 1 Congress with the power to tax, and that includes levies, right? What are levies? Tariffs. So the president has relied instead on this emergency authority. The emergency authority is really strained in this context. One, it doesn't even mention tariff in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The word tariff isn't even in there. But even if you accept that a tariff is sort of like a regulation, kinda, it's very hard to argue that we have an emergency with respect to every country in the world. So it seems really unlikely that these are legal. And the courts so far have found that they're not. I can't really make a prediction from the Supreme Court. If you look at Predictit and these online betting forums, they are betting on this, and apparently it's a coin flip. But I think I have a little more faith in the Supreme Court than that, but we'll see how they rule. So why are tariffs typically used? In poor countries, they're used because they can't come up with better taxes. And tariffs are easy to levy in part because you know where the ports are and you can go out and find it. Now, in poor countries, even in poor countries, they have turned towards more efficient sources of revenue, but you can see that their average tariff rate is somewhat higher than in rich countries. In rich countries, very few rich countries use tariffs hardly at all, but they use it for very specific reasons, for foreign policy reasons, for industrial policy reasons, as remedies, not so much as optimal tariffs. That's an argument for another day, but very limited use. And so you might say, wow, if every rich country in the world is choosing not to use this, maybe that's telling us something. And I would argue that it is. So in this case, we're trying to use tariffs. The U.S. government is trying to use tariffs in a much broader way. It has levied tariffs at a rate that's now at about 18% effective rate. But of course, by country and product, it varies because of lots of different ways. But it's on track to raise a significant amount of revenue. Right now, it's raising about $30 billion a month. So you might say, well, that's a lot of revenue. Fantastic. And if you look at the Yale Budget Lab, as you wisely did, that's, $2 to $2.5 trillion. That's nothing to sneeze at. But I would point out that the cost of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was $4 trillion. So it can't even pay for that. It certainly can't get rid of the income tax, which what the president has suggested at times. If you levied tariffs at the revenue maximizing rate, that would be in the neighborhood of the 40% by a recent calculation, that would raise enough to replace maybe 1/7 of income tax revenues. So it's really not going to be able to replace the income tax. What it has done is it's funded part of some income tax cuts, right? But there's a lot of issues about how much revenue will ultimately get out of this because there's a lot of behavioral response, including evasion, avoidance, lobbying to get special exemptions, and so forth. But the estimates are sizable, and here's a bunch of them, including one that I did in 2024, but also some others, and that those numbers are in billions over the 10-year budget window. So it's a serious amount of money, about, my best guess is a little over $2 trillion if we stuck to the policies that we have now. The problem with tariffs, even though they are kind of a consumption tax, and we might view consumption taxes as having some efficient properties, they're really distortionary consumption tax. And while, of course, triangles are smaller than rectangles, triangles do increase with the square of the tax rate. So as the tariff rate gets bigger and bigger, the distortion gets bigger and bigger. And I have a recent paper out with Maury Obstfeld where we calculate at current levels, it's in the neighborhood of 30% of revenue is just distortion. In comparison, the income tax is much lower. People think it may be more in the neighborhood of 10% of revenue, depending on the source. At the revenue maximizing rate, efficiency loss would be about 90% of revenue, right? So it's a pretty inefficient tax, and it's an inefficient tax because it is basically moving the economy's resources toward things that we're not very good at doing and away from things that we are good at doing. there's something that's kind of obscure, but in the economics literature is called the Lerner symmetry theorem. But what it basically boils down to is that a tax on imports is simultaneously a tax on exports. And how that works is it effectively sucks in resources from other parts of the economy, creates exchange rate appreciation, and makes it harder for our exporters to be successful. And one way you can see this on the ground is that exporters have to pay more for imported intermediate goods. And it turns out that our biggest importers in this country are our exporters. The big importers and the big exporters are the same firms, right? So when you're raising their costs, you're making them less competitive with respect to competitors throughout the world, which is part of the difficulty that we see with the auto industry. We now have a little bit of experience with these tariffs, and you can see non-farm payroll employment hasn't done that great. As a consequence, we've fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And now because of the shutdown, somehow we mysteriously can't produce labor reports. But the employment record isn't great. If you look at where we have had employment during the Trump months, it's mostly been education and health services, leisure and hospitality, all of which are sort of classic, not the industries we're protecting. Manufacturing, negative. Construction, negative. That's unsurprising. Wholesale trade, negative. Right? Those negative effects are partly due to the harmful effects of tariffs. And in fact, if it weren't for the massive amounts of investment that we've seen in AI, the U.S. economy would look a lot less healthy. Take the AI firms out of the stock market index or take them out of CapEx, and the general pattern looks pretty weak. There's a second problem with tariffs in addition to their vast distortions, and that's that they actually compound the left behind problem. So it's indeed the case that some people feel left behind, that we have rising, surging income inequality in this country. And I take that quite seriously in this book. Chapter 2 talks about all the reasons why we have the income inequality. And there are a lot of things going on. There's technological change, there's declining unionization, there's rising market power of companies, there's change in norms, there's change in tax and regulatory policy. It's true, trade has created some disruption. Absolutely it has. But when you look at trade, it's not really the lion's share of it. It's a smaller share of it. And the job loss, even that Otter and Dorn and their co-authors find, is in the neighborhood of a few million jobs over a decade. The U.S. economy loses and creates 8 million jobs a quarter, 6 to 8 million jobs a quarter. It's an incredibly dynamic, creative destruction place. So it's true, we can complain about certain jobs that may have been lost in certain places that are disruptive, and I think it's reasonable to sort of address those, but I think tariffs are a really inefficient way to address them. They also fall disproportionately on poor people because poor people don't save their money, right? And so any consumption tax is disproportionately going to hurt those at the bottom. You might say, well, we haven't seen big price increases, but here's what the trends were doing before and after Liberation Day, right? So there is evidence. This is a nice paper by Cavallo and his co-authors that shows kind of these big increases in the price trend after these tariffs go into place. And when those prices go up, it hurts lower quintiles in the income distribution more. What this graph is showing you is just the fraction of after-tax income that is paid in tariffs, right? And you'll see that for the lowest quintile, they lose about 4% of their income. And that's a serious hardship if you're in the lowest quintile of the income distribution. By the time you get to the top 1%, it's less than 1% of your income. That's because you're saving so much, right? So that is a big harm. And when you add it to what's going on with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act provisions, you'll see that the tariffs there are in blue. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act is in red. The net effect is the dot. And that 8 deciles, the bottom 8 deciles, are worse off by that combination in terms of their after-tax income. And the biggest hits are to the bottom 3 deciles, who are also losing things like Medicaid and food stamps, in addition to getting paltry tax cuts and tax increases through the tariffs. Only the top decile is significantly better off. The 9th decile breaks even. right? So you're taking abandoned, left behind people and you're kind of like, here, let's take away some Medicaid, let's take away some food stamps, let's give you a big consumption tax that's also very distortionary and is going to create, new shocks in the economy. Even if you weren't convinced by any of that, at least if you're going to do tariffs, you should do something much simpler where you're like, okay, we're going to have a tariff on everything. It's going to start at 1%. It'll go up by 1% a month. We're going to phase it in. We're going to do it smoothly. We're going to announce it ahead of time. That's not what's been going on here. There's been reversals and new announcements and up and down, like China every day. It seems to be like a different policy. And that creates a lot of challenges to firms and businesses who are trying to plan. There's also an enormous potential for both rent-seeking and coercion here. Not just among the firms who you'll see things like the CEO of Apple showing up in the Oval Office with literally a 24-karat gold gift to the president. Now Apple has tariff exemptions. The little firms don't necessarily get that. The big firms show up with pieces of gold. Right? So you've got that issue, but you also have coercive behavior to some of our closest allies and friends where we're telling Japan and Korea that they have to give us hundreds of billions of dollars of investment funding that will be directed by the president and his, officials, right? This is a coercive, set of demands on countries that have very open trade with the United States. In fact, Korea has a free trade agreement with the United States, as do Canada and Mexico. So it's a strange kind of way to execute foreign policy or national security to take countries that have been super close to us and alienate them so profoundly. So that's one concern. But there's also macroeconomic concerns. So this is my last slide. So I'm not going to depress you too much. You won't regret too much that there's not one because we're almost done here. But the classic macroeconomic policy dilemma is a demand shock. And when you have a demand shock, the Fed can intervene by lowering interest rates if it's a negative shock or raising interest rates if it's a positive shock. And that's really useful stabilization. When you have a supply shock, and this is a massive self-induced negative supply shock that's going on top of another self-induced negative supply shock, which is the deportations. And so you're making things in America simultaneously more expensive, and you're reducing economic activity, and you're blaming the Fed and threatening its independence at the same time, when they've got the hardest job they've had for a while, which is trying to figure out whether to accommodate the inflationary impacts of the tariffs, accommodate the recessionary impacts of the tariffs, but they can't do both, right? So that we're going to end up in a situation where the price level is a little too high and the unemployment rate is a little too high too. I don't expect that we'll see big improvements in the trade balance for the simple reason that exports will be hurt as well. And what's really driving our negative trade balance is our fiscal deficit. Like we borrow 6% of GDP every year in full employment, in peacetime. That is a lot of money that needs to flow into this country. The flip side of all that international borrowing is the trade deficit. The way that you spend more than you earn as a person, right, is to borrow from abroad, and that means you run a deficit with the rest of the people you interact with. That's exactly what the United States is doing, and I wouldn't expect the trade balance to improve until we can get control of our fiscal situation. So, tariffs are bad.
All right, that was terrific. Thank you.
So both of our speakers have touched on a lot of the topics I'm going to be asking about, but I'm going to try to get in a little more direct clash on some of these topics by asking about them maybe in a little more specific way. So I want to start with sort of first principles because we've been sort of taking the world as it is with enormous amounts of global trade, and we see that all that global trade has consequences. It makes things very complicated. Even just the economics of it are very complicated, where we have goods that go back and forth across borders multiple times to be completed. That creates all kinds of logistical issues. It creates environmental issues. It creates vulnerabilities to national policies and to defense issues. And so my first question is, why bother? If you're a large country like the United States, it's different if you're Luxembourg, but if you're a large country like the United States and you have enormous natural resources, why in the world would you bother with international trade? Maybe we should just be completely isolationist and not have any trade at all. So it's obviously a facetious question, but why why is trade good?
No, I don't think they take an anti-trade position per se, but I think what they would retort to Kim's points that I happen to agree with is that the US is a large country and the costs of being a protectionistic country when you're very large are lower. In fact, early in my career, I wrote a lot with Alberto Alizina on this very topic of the incentives that small versus large countries face to adopt different kinds of trade regimes. And it is true that large countries typically tend to be a little more protectionistic because they can produce everything domestically. They can produce more things domestically.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's, and in fact, when you look at the effects of trade on economic growth in very large countries, they're smaller than they are in very small countries. If you're Luxembourg, indeed, and you're not open, you're kind of really, really going to be poor. But if you're the US and you're not open, you can get by. And maybe there's other benefits. I think that's what they would say to having restrictions on trade. But I don't think they would advocate for autarky.
Right. Okay.
And in fact, the policy that we've seen, you could argue is very uncertain, and the data Kim showed is very clear on that because you have lots of volatility in the rates that are applied. But you could also say that it's nimble. In other words, it adjusts. So just today, the Trump administration announced that they were exempting car parts, importations of car parts by American manufacturers from tariffs. And so this is adjusting to a reality that, we discussed that it's very costly to impose tariffs on even your own domestic manufacturers when they are importing a lot of goods from abroad. And so you adjust. And so this is going to show up as another, spike in the graph. But it's one that, by and large, will improve things at the margin compared to the existing policy. So I'm not sure, I think the U.S. can it's as usual. The U.S. can get away with a lot of things on the monetary front, on the national security front, because it's got two oceans, et cetera. But it can also get away with a lot of things when it comes to trade.
So what I'm hearing is that both sides agree that trade is important. That trade really adds a lot of value. But I also heard from both of you that trade comes with significant costs that are not distributed evenly. There are serious winners and there are some serious losers. You mentioned the Rust Belt, so we'll start with you on this one. What can the U.S. do? Is our tariff, maybe a way to put it this way, are tariffs the best response for the losers in trade as a way of compensating them or protecting them? Or are there better, more targeted approaches that would, and I remember we're not asking you, Roman, we're asking the Roman alt. Why on the pro-tariff version of Roman? Are tariffs the best way to do that, or are there better policies that would help the losers and compensate the losers of this from the winnings of the winners?
Well, the problem, it depends if you ask in theory or in practice. So in theory, there are many better ways to do this, and in particular, trade theorists have argued for a very long time, and they're right that there are net gains from trade. So that, there are winners from trade, and there are people who bear the costs of trade, but the net gains are positive. And so in principle, you could redistribute some of these gains to those who are negatively affected by trade. But in practice, we haven't done that. In the U.S., we have a trade adjustment assistance program that is, I think is kind of a failure. It hasn't really helped the people that it was meant to help. And so because the political system can't really deliver this redistribution that could alleviate these problems. And so we're in a second best kind of world. We have to choose the policy instrument that we have, not the policy instrument that we wish we could have. And so that would be an argument for saying, you can protect people through tariffs. They're simple. The president has the authority. He's the delegated authority on some grounds to do it. And so let's just do that.
So, Kim, what about that? You have in your book, and I've forgotten which chapter it is, you have a beautiful list of potential ways of helping people who are hurt by trade. I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about those, but also through the lens that Roman is challenging you with, which is, are any of these politically realistic?
Yeah. So, I think there's two parts to this question. One is, if you can't do some of my wish list, are tariffs better than nothing? And I would argue that they're not. I think that they actually are net harmful to working class Americans, not just in their role as consumers, but also in their role as producers and in their role as citizens. But even setting that aside, what is feasible? Like, what can we do for people? And here I think a lot more good work needs to be done on how to get things over the finish line. But if you look at the policy tools that we have at our disposal, they're really obvious and they really work well. So one example is the child tax credit. This was massively expanded in 2021, just for 2 years, but it cut child poverty in half. And then that was reversed when the expansion went away. So if you get just a couple more seats in Congress, you can do stuff like that. The earned income tax credit is an incredibly effective low-wage subsidy. And I can even imagine having a broad wage subsidy in general for just people who've lost their job. And I wouldn't pin it to trade. I completely agree that the trade adjustment assistance has not been effective. But you could have a wage insurance such that if you lost your job, whether it was to a robot or a foreigner or because Walmart came to town and your little pharmacy shut, whatever it was, right, the government would make up some portion of the difference between your new wage and your old wage, right? That kind of wage insurance system could work well. The tax system is incredibly powerful, and most people are quite in favor of more taxes at the top of the distribution. And we can get close to getting it over the line without getting it over the line. But I think there were 48 of 50 senators in the early Biden administration who would have been for a higher corporate rate, somewhat higher rate on capital gains and dividends. You know, it's just nothing too extreme, but a few percentage points on some of these tax rates could easily compensate for this. And another good place to get revenue, of course, would be a carbon tax, which also has some potentially slightly regressive features, but I've written elsewhere about how you can completely override those with a smart way of doing it. So I think there's a lot of ways we can do that. There's also public investments you can make. If you don't have the courage to do redistribution through the tax system, you can invest in community college, which should be free nationwide. You can invest in infrastructure. You can kind of reach out to some of these left behind communities with projects and money, right? Like, and they can use that much better. Like I did a calculation that it would take almost nothing to take every coal miner and just give them $2 million to stop caring about coal, right? And we could just end coal. Like, do we really need to let a few people in West Virginia, like, ruin all of U.S. environmental policy? Not necessarily, right? Like, so if we start to think creatively about how to give people other dignified jobs, I'm not saying cut them off. Certainly we need to pay attention to left behind communities. But I think the problem with these policies is they add insult to injury.
And maybe to point out in terms of feasibility, that the carbon tax was originally a Republican idea. They've sort of run away from that, but it was originally a Republican idea.
17 of the G20 countries have one. 17 of them do, with India and Brazil the latest, right? So it's just us, Saudi Arabia, and Russia that don't.
Yeah, we're a major producer of hydrocarbons. And so
we're
it's not politically feasible to have a carbon tax in the U.S. I don't see any prospect for, but I mean, as desirable as it is, because again, all economists agree that this would be a vastly superior way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than pretty much any other policy lever. The trouble is the political system doesn't deliver that. And it also doesn't deliver the kinds of wage subsidies that you were calling for. And it hasn't delivered all of those things. And so I think that the I don't know what's in people's hearts, but I do think that the protectionistic impulses of the Trump administration come from somewhere, and it's a belief that the blue collar workers, first of all, are a big reservoir of votes for them, and that tariffs are simple to explain, appear to be at least with these voters quite popular. I mean, if you travel in I like to ask cab drivers their opinion on the economy. And when you do that, when you travel in the heartland of the U.S., invariably you talk to cab drivers, they're all protectionists. They all think that China's doing too much, So it's a very popular kind of thing. And the Trump administration is appealing to that, to those instincts. But I don't think that there's really anything that's proven. We've said here at universities on the coasts where we are all, highly educated, we've called for these policies for a long time, and then went back to our mansions in Brentwood.
But I would add that, we have had success. Like, there have been expansions of the earned income tax credit. There have been expansions of health insurance. And when those happen, they have results, right? And I worry that just because something's popular, it doesn't mean it's good. Like, these are snake oil peddlers, right? Like, they're like, take this snake oil and you'll be better off. And if we scapegoat immigrants and foreigners, that might be appealing to some cab drivers, but one would expect better.
Or hopes for better. And I'm still waiting for my mansion in Brentwood, just for the record. So. Yeah. Let's talk, speaking of things that are popular and maybe snake oil, let's talk about trade deficits. I think we're supposed to go, I've forgotten now who we're on you first, I think.
Either way.
So, when we look at the picture overall, it looks like a fairly straightforward, and you gave a nice explanation of this, the connection between trade deficits and budget deficits, that there's a clear mathematical correlation between those two things. But when we look a little more deeply, it gets really complicated, right? So we think, oh, well, because we have big budget deficits, we should have big trade deficits. But we actually have service surpluses overall. And there are a lot of countries where we even have trade surpluses, and they look nothing like one another. So we know we have a big trade deficit with China, $262 billion last year. Mexico, we hear a lot about that, $175 billion trade deficit. But Canada, with a larger economy than Mexico, also a border country, only $36 billion. And then there are countries where we have surpluses, like Australia, $33 billion, Belgium, $6 billion, Brazil, quite a different country, $29 billion, Hong Kong, $23 billion, the Netherlands, $75 billion, and Saudi Arabia, $10 billion. Actually, in the United Kingdom, $17 billion. So these are all very different countries with very different economies. It makes it sort of hard to tell the simple story that you tell, Kim, about cause and effect in math. Even though I love math, and it's very appealing to me, but it makes it really hard to understand when you look at all those very different responses. So what should this mean for trade policy and for tariffs, for that matter?
Yeah, so again, if you sort of dwell on your personal life, right? There's this question of, do you have a trade balance with the world or not? So if you're a law student and you're borrowing to attend law school, and I'm sorry about that, you may find that you're spending more than you earn this year, right? So that means that with respect to all sources of income or less than all sources of spending. So you have a global deficit, right? But you have a surplus with your employer, right? If you work as an RA, you're making money with respect to that person, or if you work at the In-N-Out Burger or wherever it is, right? And you have a big deficit with the bursar or whoever's collecting your check, right? But all those bilateral relationships are different, right? So I say it each year, I'm like a surplus country, but I have a deficit with the grocery store and a deficit with my salon and, a deficit with my kids' schools or whatever it might be, right? But a huge surplus with UCLA. And I think you can explain the same thing with countries, right? The countries that are borrowing on net have these global deficits, but they don't have deficits and surpluses with respect to everybody, right? It depends on the pattern of comparative advantage, right? So we have a surplus with Brazil. We've given them a tariff that's particularly high despite that surplus of 50%, in part because the Trump administration is dissatisfied with the prosecution of Bolsonaro. But they get that tariff, right? The original Liberation Day tariffs were a simple calculation based on the bilateral deficit, but that has very strange things where you end up with large tariffs on countries like Lesotho and Madagascar. And it's not because they're protectionist countries, it's because they're super poor and they buy some of our stuff, right? And we buy, but not that much because they're poor, and we buy more of their stuff, things like vanilla or whatever, and it seems insane to say, okay, because you're too poor to buy our things and we're buying your stuff, that we're going to give you a higher thing. So I think, they would argue, and I've heard them argue, that everything is stacked against the United States and that therefore this measure, this bilateral trade deficit, tells us how stacked they are and we can just slap tariffs on in response. But one, they're not doing that. and two, it just completely flies in the face of what we know about comparative advantage. And that doesn't mean every country is behaving, perfectly. There are ways through the WTO and other fora where we can work with trading partners. I'm like, oh, we think this is unfair. Could you do this better or whatever? And And you could imagine those kinds of negotiations, but I don't think this pattern really fits that.
What do you think about this? Should we have a different sort of response? Is this the wrong approach? That is to look at the
I don't have a
trade
defense.
deficit.
I don't have a defense of the tariff schedule that came out based on deficits and surplus. I don't think that's defensible, except perhaps for countries where there really is a very big difference in the way they treat the U.S., and then you're trying to extract concessions, and so you're trying to put huge tariffs on China to get concessions, which, but I don't really have a defense for that. I agree that there's no real justification for that. I can't fake that one.
Okay. Yeah. So I see, I have like 6 or 7 more questions, but I see already by the flow of events that we're at the part of the evening, we're supposed to turn to the questions to you all. So if you have a question for either professor, please walk up to the microphone so that the people online can hear you. And we can just form lines on both, and we'll just switch back and forth between each side of the room as people approach the microphone, and we'll take you in the order that you go. So yeah, just walk up to the microphone on your side of the room and we'll take you. I think I saw you first, so once you get there, please feel free and ask the question.
Yes, I have 2 questions, both of them for Kim. I think, and I guess like normal Roman instead of alt Roman. But my first question is, you talk a lot about like tax efficiency. Like exactly what is tax efficiency and how do you measure it, and why do we want good tax efficiency versus bad tax efficiency?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, you can calculate it in part based on simple mathematical formulas. And I have a paper called, Tariffs as Fiscal Policy, where we calculate this 30 and 90% with Maury Obstfeld. And it's basically a calculation of how much you're distorting both consumption and production. So there's 2 types of distortions really that are driving trade inefficiency. One is consumers not buying enough coffee when it gets more expensive, and the other is trying to grow coffee in Hawaii when really we should do other things, or we can't get enough out of Hawaii, right? So those together in spirit kind of are the national distortionary effect, and that's just measured mathematically. What that measure doesn't include are the additional costs of rent seeking and administrative burden, especially when it's done in such a chaotic and shambolic way. If it were done more simply, those would be smaller, right? But those aren't in the math in either instance.
Okay, and then my second question is, like, before Liberation Day, like all the economists were talking about how like the world's going to end and everything's going to be super expensive and like everything's going to crash and, we're all going to die. But, but he's on the tariffs and like, life is like mostly normal. Like, sure, like things might be slightly more expensive, but, we're more or less living our lives. So like, why hasn't the world ended, or will the world end soon and it just hasn't happened yet? And I guess Norman Roman can also answer this question as well.
I have a little start on that, then I think we should go to him too, of course. But I think that one issue is economists can get very upset about inefficient things, and it's possible that like we overreacted. But I also think there's some reason that some of this comes with lags that we're just starting to see. So it takes a while for firms to believe that this is the policy and to adjust and force the prices to go up for consumers, although we are seeing it, as you saw in that diagram. There was a lot of front running of the tariffs where firms and individuals pre-ordered things thinking that this was going to happen. And so there were inventories to burn through. There's a lot of delayed reaction, of the economic actors. So those are all confounding factors. But I think it's a big economy. And there's a lot of other things going on. I think the AI situation has really masked a lot of fundamental weakness. But, if I told you that, all that we've really done is light on fire 1,000 American dollars per person, so that's not that big of a deal, that would be true. But then you might stop and ask, like, did we need to light $1,000 on fire for each person? And I think economists do get really upset when we light money on fire. And so perhaps more upset than we should be. Like, there's a lot of more existential things we should worry about, but, I still think there'd be a better way to do it. And I also think that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better.
Do you want to address that also? Or? No, I think in general, when you think things are going to get really good, they usually don't get really as good as you think they're going to get. And if you think they're going to get really bad, they usually don't get as bad as you think they're going to get. Maybe that's a psychological distortion or a cognitive thing or something. But it's a very large economy. As I said, these numbers, they're not even the worst case scenario are these just pay it kind of tariffs. Brad Setzer, has been doing these calculations on Twitter. You can look them up. Just pay it means, we import 14% of GDP. We put an 18% tariff on that. That's 2.5% of GDP. 2.5% of GDP is not the Great Depression. It's especially if it's spread over some years and there's other causes that cause GDP to be growing, like AI and technological progress and other things. So I don't think that this is really a matter of the economy is going to be, I really believe that. I don't think it's going to destroy the American economy. I think this is, but is it a net cost? Of course, it's a net cost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, on this side.
So I really liked Professor Clausing's analogy of thinking about yourself when you're thinking about these kind of efficiencies, right? So why would I go learn how to grow my own crops when I could just go buy them from the store, essentially, right? But kind of to go down that path a little bit more, what if I really, I knew I suck at something, but I really, really want to get better at it because I, thinking towards the future, really want to produce a particular thing. The thing that I'm kind of beating around the bush for is basically semiconductors, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, semiconductors and the whole AI thing is a really large economic pot that people are trying to prospect into. So by kind of maybe giving myself some tuition, essentially, to learn how to make those semiconductors better, maybe that as an investment towards the future could be advisable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that one thought is that subsidies can play that role well and that are first best, but that if you can't, that tariffs could provide temporary protection in strategic industries. And I would be much more comfortable with a limited argument where you're okay, well, we have to do this thing at home. We want to make our own weapons or whatever. And so because of that, we're going to invest in American productivity there, right? But this carte blanche approach, is different from that, right? So I think when you identify a strategic industry, you want to figure out a couple of things, why is it strategic? What do we get as a country from it? Why is the market failing to do it? And sometimes the market will fail because there's a lot of learning involved, as you point out. And the industry as a whole needs to grow. And so if one firm does the learning, they won't be able to appropriate it. So they won't do enough investment to get us kind of down the learning curve. So you can certainly make an argument for subsidies on those regards and on tariffs if you don't have access to the subsidy tool, because it'll at least provide more room for that infant industry to grow. The problem is you kind of want to make sure the infants grow up, right? And there are some instances, many more instances of failure than success where governments will protect an industry and then watch it never grow up. And so then maybe it's worth it because it's so important that you have it, that having an inefficient one that's made at home is okay. But for a lot of things, it's not clear that that's the case, especially if there are other countries in the world that you get along with that also make things, right? So chips are a really salient example in part because we're so reliant on Taiwan, and Taiwan itself is very much subject to geopolitical pressure and concern, right? And so that you might think, well, that's an area that we need to invest in. And so the CHIPS Act was one, attempt for government to get involved in that regard, and that was a subsidy approach.
Thanks.
Hey, no.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, please, sorry. Removing my hat as though, this fake thing that I was doing. There's these infant industry arguments, we've made them as economists. Alwyn Young has a paper on industries that have a lot of learning by doing. You want to favor them, so maybe you can put a tariff that favors these industries. The problem is that in practice, they're often abused. Then you start making arguments about everything. Oh, my industry has a lot of learning by doing. Please give me protection. And so it becomes a political thing and it gets abused. And what's really critical when it comes to semiconductors is not reshoring. It's diversifying the supply chain. In fact, reshoring is not a form of diversification because now suddenly you're dependent on your own production and something could go wrong. You know, it could be a hurricane that destroys your facility or something. But at any rate, what is important is really to have, not rely only on Taiwan, because Taiwan could be, quote unquote, reunited with mainland China tomorrow, and then we're in real trouble. So diversifying the supply chain is really what's important, not necessarily having your own capacity. So even these arguments I find often don't really work in practice.
Yeah.
We'll see. The CHIPS Act, I don't think, is a huge success.
No, I agree. Yeah, I agree with everything he said. And we actually go through this in the beginning of that tariffs as fiscal policy. So if you want the beach read, there's open, but the tariffs as fiscal policy paper also goes through the industrial policy argument too. And I completely agree.
Perfect. Plug for the book.
We'll take one more question.
I definitely support free trade. One question that I have, though, or one concern, is that when manufacturing moved to China and other developing countries, there's a rise in fast fashion and other, more plastic goods that just are not environmentally friendly, not sustainable. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on potentially having tariffs on some of these, environmentally harmful products.
Maybe I see we got another question also. So why don't you just ask yours also? We'll see if we can combine them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure. My question is, Professor Clausing, you mentioned that you thought things are going to get worse before they get better. I don't agree with the person who mentioned things seem okay. I do feel like things have gotten really tough for different segments of our community. So I'd like to know, what, if you could unpack a little bit what that worse looks like, because yes, maybe the economist did dial things, a little too far, but I am interested to hear what worse could look like, because I do think it's pretty bad.
So sure, both really good questions. The environmental, I'll start with that one briefly, and then I'm sure we want to hear what Romain says. Yeah. But the environmental one is really interesting. And some people have suggested, for instance, like carbon tariffs, where you basically, because you don't have the courage to do it domestically, you just tax the imports of environmentally harmful things. I'm a little bit skeptical of that without the domestic policy to go with it. So for instance, I'm fine with taxing it at home and what comes in, right? But some countries are doing that. In fact, like a lot of them, like the European Union is doing it. Canada's exploring it. 17 countries carbon price, and the border adjustment part of it, where you also carbon price the imports, is in live consideration in many countries. So I think that could actually create a virtuous circle where, by applying the same standards to the imports that you're applying at home, you're encouraging regulation abroad as well as here, right? I worry that if we're only applying it to the imports, that we're kind of undermining these more non-distortionary methods and non-discriminatory, and it's a WTO word to suggest that, basically that you're not tilting the playing field just in favor of domestic things, but you're applying it uniformly. But if I had to choose between tariffing just, the dirty things versus this, I would definitely prefer that, right? And I think that at least you'd have a rationale that you're tilting American consumption away from those things, but you'd be also encouraging American production of the same thing. So you wouldn't want the American firms to start doing the things that we can no longer buy. In terms of the worst case scenario, I think I agree with Romain that, there's a lot of other things in the economy that are probably as important. But when I'm looking at the next few years, imagine, for instance, that AI, while very promising, doesn't deliver the kind of revenue growth that we expect it to justify all of that investment and all of that stock market valuation. And that exposes financial fragility and leads to a stock market decline, which itself erodes consumer and investor confidence. At the same time that we already have the negative effects of tariffs, of immigration restrictions, which are very harmful to the economy, and the challenges to Fed independence. And if we layer on top of that an erosion of that institution, if Lisa Cook were fired because the Supreme Court decides that that's okay, that gives, and even if Jerome Powell stays, this is inside baseball, but then Trump could potentially stack the entire Open Markets Committee in a way that led to much looser monetary policy. So the worst case scenario looks pretty bad. But also the best case scenario doesn't look bad at all, right? Like, and this is why economists are terrible forecasters. So best case scenario, we hobble through with, yeah, it's inefficient, but we're burning a couple $1,000s a year. AI does better than I was hoping and leads to productivity gains that are broad, that go across lots of industries. It's possible that this just looks like kind of a myth few years as opposed to the more disastrous thing. And so I don't have like great probabilities to assign to all of these things, but I think there's the range of possibility looks a lot wider to me than it did a year ago.
Thank you.
What would you want to agree with that? I mean, the case for, that you mentioned for putting tariffs on environmentally harmful goods is prototypical case of intervention to address an externality. There's an externality, you want to reduce that. The question is whether it's the best way to do that compared to addressing directly the source of the externality, which is the production of environmentally harmful goods, not the trading of environmentally harmful goods. There's a big literature on, having exported pollution. Like a lot of the pattern of comparative advantage has been we've specialized in services. Developing countries have specialized in more polluting manufacturing that's allowed rich countries to clean up their environment at the cost of making the environment dirtier in developing countries. And the solution to that is technology. Everybody should adopt technologies that produce, cleaner. The solution to that is not to restrict trade because that's just going to move pollution from one place to the other. It's not going to reduce the aggregate amount of pollution. On the bad stuff, I mean, I agree. There was I think it was a baseball player, you were all watching the game, that said that predictions are really hard to make, especially when they're about the future. Yogi Berra, sorry. And, or another one said, economic forecasting was invented to make astrology look respectable. Although that one, I don't think we quite know the authorship. People say John Kenneth Galbraith, but I don't think it's true. Anyway, I don't know. There are so many factors. If you are asking the question of specifically what's bad about the tariff policies, so it's not, you're feeling maybe that things are terrible in certain communities is absolutely well taken, and it's absolutely true. But is it the tariffs? There's many other things that are going on with the undermining of institutions, with immigration policy and everything. Perhaps are responsible for that. When it comes to the tariff piece, that's I think where the comment came from. About whether the tariffs had catastrophic effects. I think it's true. They have had catastrophic effects. Bad effects directionally, yes. Will they benefit some people? Probably yes. There will be some manufacturers that are happy to have them.
So with that, thank you both. Those were excellent questions. And with that, we will bring the online portion and the EV to close. Thank you, all of you who are out there online, for joining us. I'm sorry we can't feed you. But I'm just so appreciative to both of our speakers, especially at a time of increasing polarization on issues that are really emotionally charged. It is so important for universities like ours to serve as a forum for enlightened discussions on both sides, where we have much more light than heat. So thank you both for being such wonderful exemplars of that philosophy and of UCLA's, which bring in the very best that UCLA has to offer. So thank you both. Please join me in thanking our speakers.